Hello and welcome to the Stumble Across podcast. This is the podcast where basically I stumble across someone online and invite them for a chat and see what happens. I mean, this is completely unprepared, completely unfiltered, and can often lead to some interesting stories. So we'll see where we go today. So I just put out a post saying, I'm doing this podcast. Who wants to come on with no preparation whatsoever? Maybe a sentence about them, but that's about it. First of all, welcome along to the podcast. The only thing, and this happens quite a lot in this podcast, the only thing I know is your username. I literally know nothing about you. So, Paranoid American is what I'm seeing at the moment. Tell me, what exactly are you paranoid about?
That's a great question. Being paranoid, I think, is just sort of like an American, like almost a lot of things that I do are shaped by just pure Americana, American pop culture, American military training, American everything. And admittedly so, I've also remained somewhat ignorant of being outside of the walls of America in many different ways. So it's kind of a self-deprecating nod towards, living in that sort of like everything's America. You just become paranoid just from being here,
So what is your name? Sorry, I didn't even ask.
So my name's Thomas Gorin. It's nice to meet you.
And you obviously live in America then?
Yeah, yeah.
So the background, I have to say, if you're watching the video version of this podcast, I think it's one of the best backgrounds. During pandemic, we all had the Zoom backgrounds. We all had to organize our homes together to make it look like we had, shit together. But you've definitely done that with the background. Love it.
The Simpsons meme comes to mind of Lenny saying, like, please, God, don't tell anyone how I live.
Exactly. That's exactly it. I guess into conspiracies, judging by the background.
Yeah, very much so. I've considered myself a conspiracy theorist connoisseur for a while. Started in probably like the early 2000s, and it just kind of became a fascination. So for whatever reason, I kind of made it my goal to watch every conspiracy theory movie, documentary, read plenty of books about it. It's just, I kind of see it as a modern day mythology. It's like we don't have Zeus anymore, but we do have the JFK assassination, and they kind of rival each other in that same level of mythology, and some people believing literal interpretations and being allegories, and magic is involved. So I honestly 100% believe that modern day conspiracy theories are the best we're gonna have to the Odyssey, unfortunately, but that's kind of how it is.
And I mean, whether you're into it or not, I must say they are very interesting when you get into them. Whether you do, you take everything for its word. But when you get into, it's that kind of depth of YouTube, I think, of sometimes when you watch one video, you get into another one, and you end up watching those types of videos. And there's moments where you do question things.
I gotta say that the modern version of conspiracy theories on YouTube is a vastly different landscape than because I originally started getting really interested in the topic itself around like the mid 90s. So it was all AM radio shows and DVDs and VHSs that were passed hand to hand, and then eventually internet started showing like a little bit of clips here and there, but it wasn't like everyone that had a phone all of a sudden also had a YouTube channel. So a lot of the things in the early days of the internet too were sort of those hand to hand passed VHS cassette tapes that just happen to be digitized. And then fast forward to modern day, and the amount of content is overwhelming, and the amount of takes and interpretations. It's before you had like 50 to pick from, and now you've got like 50,000.
Yeah. With you kind of following these conspiracies, would you say that some of them go too far? Would you see some videos and you think, that's
absolutely
just ridiculous?
I mean, of course, because I think one of the reasons why conspiracy theories exist at all is just because of a lack of information. Sometimes it's like an intentional. So when you're talking about like military and government conspiracies, I mean, that lack of information and being opaque is intentional because of, secrets and security and things like that. But it also just invites people to speculate, and that speculation tends to kind of lean towards conspiracy. But that exists in, every sphere, even, in the podcast world, for example. If you wanted to get on like bigger and bigger podcasts, there's like certain kind of like gatekeepers, more or less, right? So, I mean, it's not like they come together and they sit around a table, that's like dimly lit, and they pass around like a skull filled with blood and drink from it. But they message each other on Slack, and they message each other on Zoom, and again, it exists everywhere. So one of my favorite concepts here is that your mom and dad planning a surprise birthday for you could technically be a conspiracy. So it's just a matter of like conspiratorial thinking that makes it the conspiracy or not.
It's so interesting. I've never thought of it like that. It's so interesting you say that, where it's the lack of knowledge sometimes. Because I guess, like a rumor, if you don't know something, you'll rumor something and then it will just turn into something else.
There's sort of this like propensity to want to come up with a grand unification theory, like one thing, and it tends to be Illuminati, right? That's like a keyword that tends to come up, Illuminati or adrenochrome. And so people tend to like to push everything towards, well, the media is the way it is, and the government's the way it is, and the currency and everything is because the Illuminati is doing it, because it's like one central thing. And then everything you can sort of like tie, beyond that. And it's almost like an inverted version of scientific theory, where you're supposed to observe and then come up with some kind of theories on what you think is at play based on what you're observing. But usually with conspiracy theories, you start with, okay, this is what's happening. Now let me find all the reasons that back this kind of thing up. So there's a lot of starting with the premise and then working backwards to make things fit into that premise, which kind of, comes into where it's interesting, is that that's how you would write fiction. You would usually start with like some cool ending or some cool twist or concept, and then like build characters around it and build a storyline around it and figure out how to, pace the reader to get to that point. And it's, writing like a really good fiction story and coming up with a conspiracy theory. I don't know how people, how much they realize there's so much the same.
Yeah, because like there's somewhere I look at and the amount of detail sometimes you think, how would anyone have ever spotted that? Like, how would anyone have ever come up with that? So there is a wee bit of intelligence in actually getting to that point. But what I want to ask, right, and this is going to be probably the hardest question, what would be your favorite conspiracy right now?
Oh, I mean, it's not a hard question, because the one that I tend to just focus on the most is MK Ultra, which is a government mind control program that there was a version of it as well in almost every different country, but the Americans version, MK Ultra, and that one I think is my favorite because it's got so much documentation and so many crazy stories that sound outrageous, but when you look it up, like one example is a guy named Jose Delgado, and he made what they called the brain stimulus, and more crudely, it was really just like an antenna that they jammed inside of the brain of a bull and then sent it, a wave that would then kind of like shock it, give it like a little electroshock. Because in the 50s, electroshock therapy was all the rage, right? They still thought that this was the future. So this was one of the inventions that they had, but that kind of carried out onto modern day. But imagine in the 50s how wild it would have been to say, I can control a bull through this rate. And that's kind of how it was pitched. And that's not necessarily how the technology really worked. But this was one of many different, and there was like over 150 different programs that were all focused on just the CIA trying to figure out how to control the human mind in any different way they could imagine. Drugs, technology, therapy, hypnosis. So that's my go-to because there's so much government, FOIA-backed information that backs it up.
And like, how do you go from rumor to conspiracy? Like, but there must be a fine borderline between something who's just, someone who says something and something that actually is a full-blown conspiracy.
Well, the word or actually the phrase conspiracy theory itself is a conspiracy because during the JFK assassination, and this is, again, a conspiracy because it's rumored. I can't point to like the exact document and the date, but right around the time of JFK assassination, when people were starting to theorize, was it the mafia, was it the CIA, was it the Cubans, the CIA put together this phrase, conspiracy theory, and started pushing it out. And you see it now in modern day media where like a certain topic will get like its catchphrase or its little slogan nickname that's like cutesy, and everyone just kind of like latches onto it, right? And that was sort of one of the very first versions, and it was propaganda that they've been learning over the last century plus. But it was like, hey, if we can just come up with this term conspiracy theory so that anytime an unfavorable suggestion comes up in the media, we can just always throw it under this one category, and the public will eventually realize, they'll be trained that, oh, if it goes into this category, then ignore it because, it's just silly, fanciful stuff. But, over the years, a lot of things that get lobbed into that category sometimes, seep their way back out and being out of that category again years later. But no one's the wiser. It's the same concept of the newspaper puts out the huge headline, and then a week later they put a retraction on page 8 in, the bytext. Well, people latch onto the headline and, even though they did the retraction. So it's that same concept.
Yeah. Now, I must say, I'm very tame when it comes to conspiracies, right? One that jumps out at me straight away is the one about the end of Grease. Grease, the movie, where the conspiracy is that they die at the end of the movie because the car has gone up, because the car has gone up into the sky and they die. That's how tame my level of conspiracy is.
I mean, that's sort of more of a, inside, in the end of The Sopranos, what happened?
Yeah.
Did Tony Soprano die? And yeah, I guess that's also a realm of conspiracy theory and kind of like fan fiction, which is so much bleed over, right? Because a lot of conspiracy theories are sort of historical fan fiction. Even if you don't know all the pieces, again, if you're writing this fiction story, JFK died, and at the time the Cubans were against him, but also maybe the FBI and the CIA. So depending on where you want to take your story, you patch those pieces. And the JFK one is a good example because so many people have put together their own narratives of that. There's almost an infinite number of JFK conspiracy theories, from the president of Haiti put a voodoo curse on him and that caused him to die, to that there were body doubles, there was multiple JFKs, there were multiple Lee Harvey Oswalds, aliens, all every single concept you could think of has been attributed to that. But, and that's a really old version, which again, the old style conspiracy theories like JFK and the more modern versions are vastly different, because now, something comes up and the VMA awards, and if someone covers up one eye, right, they do this thing, then all of a sudden 100,000 videos and social posts are all proof that they're in the Bavarian Illuminati, dating back to the 1700s. They're in it. Lady Gaga's in it.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, you can't mention conspiracy without thinking, Area 51. This must be one of my favorite topics of videos to watch on YouTube. The guys who go up and they just try to find out what's going on.
So, and Area 51 now is sort of a blanket term itself, right? Because Area 51 kind of alludes to the early crashes in the 50s and Roswell landing, where they scooped up all the remainder parts and they whisked it off to Area 51 and the rumors is that this is where the transistor came from, and we didn't have any kind of advanced technology like the transistor without alien landings. But now the modern equivalent is these Navy pilots with the footage of these, objects out in space and out in, the upper atmosphere, just zipping around in ways that we don't know how to do ourselves.
Yeah. What about that one? Have you seen that one? I can't think of the name of it, but it kind of shoots across the grass, and it's instant. UFO, I suppose you'd say, which just shoots across the grass, and it's just, the speed of it is just immense.
And it's usually just not the speed, but it's the way that they're able to turn an exact 90 degrees without losing any speed and without having a typical trajectory that we're used to seeing based on all of our aircraft knowledge. So, and again, it's that lack of knowledge where even maybe the pilot doesn't know what the hell they're looking at, but maybe someone knows what they're looking at, and they're just not spilling the beans, right? Now all of a sudden it leads to speculation, and now the pilots are going on Joe Rogan and talking about aliens, and so you can see how it spreads out and breeds. And who knows, no one really knows, the truth is out there though, right? That's the that's the go-to quote.
And where do you stand when it comes to celebrities? A big one is, about when they zoom right into some celebrities, they see a mask line and they think that's not the real person, that's a mask over their face.
I mean, so I'm a little bit, despite the background and despite the name, and despite that I've been writing about conspiracies for 20 years plus here, I'm actually a little bit more skeptical than most people would expect me to be. So I tend, the ones that I really believe in, I really think that I can make a convincing argument. But when it comes to people shape-shifting on TV or wearing masks or, being reptilians and having double eyelids and more boringly, I tend to explain that away with artifacting in the video feed and like wearing the mask is because they cake on, like, I mean, they kind of are wearing a mask with the amount of sort of like anti-glare things that they're putting on. And so, and even now, if you watch like a high quality movie in 4K, you know, you can see the actors clearly have like a different skin tone depending on where they thought the camera was going to be focusing on in certain scenes. So I'm boring when it comes to that, but I do believe that there is absolutely a modern day version. I mean, it's not a Bavarian Illuminati, but it's the modern day version, which happens in, again, boardrooms and Instagram DMs and sort of like private Telegram groups where people, you know, blackball each other. And like the term, everyone knows what the term blackballing is, right? It's when like the industry decides you're not going to go forward and they're just going to like end your career. You're going to get canceled. Well, blackballing is a term from Freemasons, and that's how they would vote a member into their lodge or not. It has to be unanimous. And if it's not unanimous, everyone has this anonymous vote they cast. And you can, if you put a black ball into the voting box, once they open it to tally, if they see a black ball, that person doesn't get into the lodge. So there's so many phrases, again, like blackballing itself happening in Instagram DMs and, you know, corporate emails, that actually happens. But the name is based on a secret society, and the concept itself of working behind the scenes to decide, you know, who gets ahead and who doesn't, that in itself is very much conspiratorial, and it happens everywhere.
Because I've watched so many videos, and one, like Amy Winehouse comes to mind, and I've watched so many different videos of we say celebrities in that, and it gets to a point where my head just can't take it anymore. Like there's just so much information in there, you can't process it. you can't say whether it's real, you can't say whether it's real, whether it's fake, because you've just been watching so much.
Well, so I mean, if you really care about being able to separate the wheat from the chaff, right? Especially when it comes into conspiracy theories, you can just lose your mind, and I think a lot of people do tend to lose their mind. And this is like an old technique, but there's this concept of the trivium and the quadrivium, which were the classical 7 liberal arts, and it's a way that you can structure your thinking to just avoid getting into weird, endless loops of, you know, logical fallacies and things. In fact, the entire concept of logical fallacy, it's almost only taught now about debates, and maybe if you're just trying to make like a point on the internet, you know what I mean, that people will throw out some logical fallacies. But that truly was one of what they call the trivium, which were like the 3 fundamental things that you would teach someone, which was grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Well, now you kind of get grammar in public education in the same way that, you know, spelling and knowing how to pronounce words and what they mean in context. But you don't really get logic anymore in traditional education unless you go into very specific fields. And you definitely don't get rhetoric taught in any kind of like classical way. Now rhetoric is taught in sort of like influencer videos and just like, you know, 7 tips on gaining friends and winning influence over people. Like it's all sort of like self-help version. But that used to be, you would go to school and they would teach you those things before anything else, before you got into math or science or, you know, any sort of like art. You know, you had, before you were even allowed to start painting and sculpting, you were pretty much taught these 3 things. So if you follow those same kind of 3 things, and then the quadrivium, which were 4 ones that come after that, well, I'm not going to get into. We focus on the trivium. You can structure your thinking in a way that as you encounter these theories, and you watch some weird YouTube video on Amy Winehouse being in the 27 Club and they're being ritualistically, you know, killed or whatever, like you basically, one of the steps is get all the different theories out there. If you really cared about the Amy Winehouse one in particular, you get all the theories you can think of. Let's say there's 20, and you boil it down to like the top 3 that you think are the most logical to you personally for whatever reason. And I would make a convincing argument, I think, that the 27 Club is also just, you know, the easiest one is that young people get a bunch of money and they're surrounded by drugs and fame and wealth, and they just, you know, go overboard with it. Another version of the 27 Club, if you don't want the most tame explanation, is that young artists at their peak are worth far more dead than they would be alive. And also, if they're killed off at their peak, then that means they never fade out, they never fizzle out, you know, they get to remain like this god forever. But then the record company and whoever owns the masters gets to just re-release that for, you know, for perpetuity. And if they don't die, then, you know, the artist has a lot more say and a lot more sway over what happens to their music. And over time, maybe they try to repurchase their masters, and, you know, they can tweet and get their fans on board with stuff. The second they die, whoever's in charge of that Twitter account, now they get to be the voice of that person, you know, for the next 100 years. So, and that's how you get Tupac rapping as a hologram on stage now, you know.
That's what's just so interesting about it, and that's where it just gets so in depth. Like, do you think that you can overthink the whole situation when you're looking at all those different theories and you're just sitting thinking, is there a way out of this?
Well, of course. I mean, the whole entire premise of conspiracy theories is just like thinking, because you can't do any of it in practice. You're not going to build your own twin towers and like re-simulate it. There was a Kickstarter, I think someone wanted to like actually recreate but anyways, you can't do that. Like, and the things that happen, they don't happen in vacuums where you can recreate it either. And I think one of the things that'll help you keep sane is that you can't ever really know someone's intent. All you can know is what happened before and the effects afterwards, and the actual intent into what went into something. Someone can take that to the grave, or they can lie about it and say one intent versus another. They can be conflicted themselves in what their intent was. So there's this premise of one of Clarke's laws, I think. It's like any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. That's, you know, if I know something that you don't know, you know, science-wise, I can pretend that, like, I'm this, you know, I control the sun, or I control, you know, like, all these different just natural phenomenon. If I know about it and you don't, I can pretend that I've got magical powers. That's essentially what that amounts to. And, like, I don't know the intent behind that, but if you're pretending to be a magician and you know that you're not a magician and you're still doing it, well, now there's, like, this different intent. But to the layperson, what does it really matter what the intent of that person is? You know, whether it's a priest or it's whoever you think that might be. So, and there's another aspect of that. I think it's called Gray's Law. I might be misquoting that, but it's that any sufficiently advanced ineptitude is indistinguishable from malice. So if you do something,
blew my mind there.
if you do something that's so horrendously horrible, and it has such horrible after effects, then it doesn't really matter what your intent was. It's the same concept of like end justifies the means, but instead of like I get to do a bunch of nasty things, and then if I win at the end, then you know that makes me right. It's not that. It's more of like the inverse of it, but it's a similar property.
Yeah. That's the point where I can't take any more. Like, that's a bit my head just can't process all of that. But it's so interesting. It really is amazing to take all that. Is there anything that you have kind of come up with yourself? Is there an idea, a kind of theory that you've thought, hang on,
well,
no one's thought of that?
So a number of them. So my name being Paranoid American here, I started a comic company about 10 years ago. I worked at Disney for 10 years as an animator and an interactive designer. And while I was there, I had already been sort of obsessed with conspiracy theories, and I'm looking left and right at all these animators and great artists and thinking like, man, I should do something with this while I'm here. So I started a comic company, Paranoid American, and there I've kind of exercised a few of my absolute favorite theories. Like, one example is I mentioned Lee Harvey Oswald, and that it was actually like voodoo that killed JFK. So I've got a comic series called Lee's Demons, and it's essentially about him being trained from a young age by Papa Legba, which is like a Haitian sort of, you know, spiritual guide, and he trains Lee in how to fight demons, and it all culminates in the JFK assassination. And another one called Never a Straight Answer, which the acronym is NASA, and this is about Stanley Kubrick directing the Apollo moon landings, which I do unironically think that we probably did. I don't know if we hired Stanley Kubrick directly, but I absolutely think that some of the footage that got its way out into everyone's living rooms was done in a soundstage, and it was not live streamed from the moon.
That's incredible.
So, and it makes it so much easier to explain my ideas through comic books, because then it doesn't sound like I'm being doom and gloomy and overly serious and like, believe this, otherwise, you know, the chrome reptilians are going to get you. I don't, you know, like when you're reading it and you see like cartoony color, like there's a spread that covers how the Beatles, around the same time when this was purported to have happened, the Beatles approached Stanley Kubrick because they wanted to be in a Lord of the Rings movie. They wanted to make the first musical Lord of the Rings. So I kind of cover that in the comic, but he's too busy doing the Apollo moon landings, so otherwise that would have happened. So it's kind of like showing like what that might have looked like if Stanley Kubrick directed Lord of the Rings starring the Beatles, if he wasn't preoccupied with the NASA moon landings.
Incredible. And do you mind me asking about Disney?
Yeah, go ahead.
The one thing that always strikes me about Disney is the story of someone deleting Toy Story.
I don't know if I've heard this one actually.
So about now, let me get this right. There was an animator who went off on maternity leave, and accidentally someone in the office then who was brought in accidentally deleted. Was it the second? I think it was maybe the first Toy Story. The whole thing, they deleted the whole thing, and it was only because that person went off on maternity leave that she had it at home on her local copy that she saved Toy Story.
I mean, it doesn't surprise me because I've seen worse happen, I think.
So it wasn't you that went in and pressed delete?
No, I didn't do that. I also didn't do that with the NASA moon landings either, which were also, I don't know if you know, were accidentally written over.
And as your so how long did you work there at Disney?
Just short of 10 years. It was like 9 months or 9 years and 8 months, something like that. Yeah.
How was your experience there?
I loved it. I mean, I worked on the park, so if we got into a long project, you could literally just get up and go and ride a roller coaster and then go back to the office. Like,
oh, I never thought of that.
I mean, it was great. I mean, it was literally a 5-minute walk from, once I got out of my building, it was like a 10-minute walk out of the building. It was a huge studio, sound stages and stuff. Once I got out of the building, it was a 5-minute walk to the Tower of Terror and to Rock and Roller Coaster. It was at Hollywood Studios in Orlando. So anytime I could just kind of pop over there, and we had projects at Epcot, and we had projects at the other, parks. So, for work, we would just have to go and ride rides. And so, I mean, there was a lot of boring versions of it too, but those ones aren't fun to talk about, the long hours of just like tedious work. So I loved it, and I got to work with creative people. I mean, there was like a movie theater in the office, like an actual movie theater. So just the concept of being at Disney and living in, this magical world that doesn't actually exist anywhere. I mean, so I got to live inside that for a long time.
And what did you work on?
Well, a lot of in-park type stuff. So if you went to Epcot Center in Orlando, and there's this huge spaceship Earth, and it's like a slow ride that starts with cavemen, and then it works its way to like Steve Jobs and then the future, and then it spits you out into this big room that's got all kinds of interactive games and sort of like big high score lists all over the place. A lot of those sort of interactive games, not the ones you'd see now in 2022, but the ones maybe you saw 10 years ago or 5 years ago. So those interactives were things that we had made. And then also a lot of people don't realize that, other companies love Disney, so they'll contract Disney people, like Disney directly. They'll just hire Disney and say, hey, we're opening up a museum somewhere. And we want you guys to design exhibits. So we would do a lot of contract work. There was one called the Museum of Crime and Punishment in D.C. that was owned by John Walsh from America's Most Wanted, and that one I think was open for just around 8 years or so. It's a rough bit. It was the only for-profit museum in that district of downtown DC for like the longest time, but they didn't survive because everything else is funded by government and nonprofit and stuff. So but a lot of things like that, a lot of like museums around the country, we helped facilitate a lot of that stuff. And then there was a bunch of kids shows that I had worked on that made their way onto like Nickelodeon and direct to DVD. And I didn't do a lot of like the illustration, but I do the animation and specifically writing scripts that would make the animation easier. So one of the examples is that there was a kid show where a guy was like constantly running towards a screen. They would show it in schools all over the country. And I wrote a script that just made the background look like it was constantly like looping. So like a thing would get big and then small and, just little tools like that would make people's life easier. That was sort of my job there,
The time that you put into something like that must be just unthinkable, because if you think nowadays you want to do it in a few clicks of a button, but the process, it must be so tedious to get to that point.
Well, I still got to do it digitally, but we were just working in slightly older for like, this will get too technical, but when we started, we were using something called Director, which it wasn't even owned by Macromedia at the time, but Macromedia Director, and then that got purchased by Adobe, and then Director turned into Flash, and then a bunch of things kind of happened in, interactive Flash games and a lot of kiosks and stuff, and then Flash died because Apple killed it, and then that turned into Unity and Unreal Engine, and all sorts of other, things that kind of evolved from out of that. So, and my tool set was constantly evolving, and that the animated script that I was mentioning before was something in Adobe After Effects, in an old school version of expressions where you would just, pick whip like a bunch of different elements in a scene and put some code behind it, so they just like did things automatically. And a lot of the time the actual animators that were doing like the frame by frame stuff and setting the keyframes, they don't even know how it works. They just know that the background will just always work no matter where they put the camera and no matter how fast they speed it up. Like, they don't have to worry about the background looking good.
Mm-hmm. Please say, for those watching the video podcast, please say that you designed the background that I see.
Well, I have to give credit. So I did the animated part, like the animations and stuff I threw together. But this was done by an artist that I'm working with.
When you say that threw together, that's not threw together. That is some top work.
No, I appreciate it.
It's not just food.
And she like zipping in and out and stuff. Yeah. This is really just using all After Effects 100%. But the artist here is Igor Chikal, and he's the lead artist on a comic series I've actually got about conspiracy podcasters. It's called The Chosen One, and is based on my friend that's got a podcast called The One on One Podcast. But the artist that did this background, I loved it so much that we had him do 2 different issues of this comic book.
Mm-hmm. And before we leave it, would you think of starting up your own podcast? All these conspiracy theories that you kind of want to get off your chest?
Maybe. It's more fun being a host a little bit. It's kind of the same concept of like, it's more fun to visit kids or visit like a cat or something than to own them yourself, because you don't have to deal with all of the upkeep and the maintenance and the ups and downs.
Yeah.
There's something so alluring to just like, I get sent a link at 9 a.m. and I do a quick interview and then it's over, and
you can lock it away
with my day. Yeah. I don't have to sit down and edit it and do all of like the audio leveling and making the little clips and stuff. And the second you start a podcast, not only are you doing that, but you're doing it every day, constantly. And then even if you get big enough and hire someone else, like, you still have to worry about them doing it, right? And and like, there's this element of having to control so much, specifically in podcasts, because even if you've got a team, like the podcasting, it's usually like the on-air personalities, and there's so much on the shoulders. So it's been suggested many times, and there's so many topics that I would absolutely love to just do deep dives, and other people are doing them, and I just don't think they're being done right in some regards and not given the right amount of attention. But maybe one day after I've got a bunch of comics published and I'm kind of like taking a break from it, I might start a podcast.
Well, thanks so much. This is exactly what the podcast is about, just discovering people like you. That's amazing. Very interesting indeed. And thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you so much.
And we'll be back again next week, of course, with another mystery guest that we stumble across online. Don't forget to follow us on our socials on Instagram. All the links in the bio, and leave a little review if you like the podcast.